Will Europe's populists finally make a breakthrough? Mainstream politicians face a challenge from the far right as 400 million Europeans vote in this week's EU Parliament elections. How will voting shape the future of the continent? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to this special edition of Inside Story from London. I'm Barbara Serra. The world's second largest democratic election starts on Thursday. Voters in 28 countries will choose 751 members of the EU Parliament. Immigration and the economy are dominating the political agenda, and the rise of the far right is dominating the headlines. Mainstream politicians are calling for a united Europe, urging voters to reject right-wing and populist candidates. Far-right leaders, meanwhile, from nearly a dozen countries, including France, Germany and the Netherlands, were in Italy on Saturday in a show of unity. The rally in Milan was led by Italy's Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini, who wants to form a powerful far-right bloc within the EU Parliament. Some analysts are saying the future of the European Union is at stake. We'll talk to our guests in just a moment. First, though, this report from Osama bin Javaid in Milan.
Matteo Salvini, Italy's Deputy Prime Minister and Interior Minister, is hoping to upset the status quo during this European Union elections. He plans to do it with the help of Eurosceptics, whose anti-immigrant and nationalist slogans are pulling crowds in ailing economies.
We need to do everything that is right to free this country, this continent, from the illegal occupation organised by Brussels.
Instead of traditional billboards and TV ads, social media has been instrumental in getting the League's message across and making inroads into traditional left-leaning cities such as Milan. And it found an audience in the richer parts of northern Italy, where some relate to slogans such as "Why should we pay for others who don't contribute as much?" Alessandro Morelli has been with Salvini since the beginning. He blames a divided EU for Italy's woes.
France decided to start a military operation against Libya, which caused very serious damage not only in Italy, but also in Europe. Europe today is totally divided and only exists for the interests of France and Germany.
Many Italians disagree with the populists, and they have been protesting with thousands of homemade banners. The movement grew after the government forcibly removed slogans from a balcony by using firefighters. To Salvini's opponents, this was one more manifestation of authoritarianism and fascism, which they say is being peddled by the League Party.
I think that this kind of politics, this hatred, this being against everything, is beginning to make people feel sick.
This election has become more interesting than previous ones. Besides UK's Brexit failure, there's also a surge of populists across Europe. Among them is Italy's Matteo Salvini, whose populist policies about immigration and economy has found him allies from Germany to Hungary. And this new alliance wants to overhaul the European Union.
Alessandro Madron wrote a book about the rise of Salvini in 2015. He fears that a strong right-wing alliance in the long run could mean the end of the European dream.
European politics have been too far from people and too close to finance. Europe was not able to give real answers, as it put too many limits on everything. And there are many parts of the European population who felt the burden of the European Union without feeling the advantages.
The European Parliament consists of 751 MEPs, representing more than 500 million people from 28 countries. The big question is, how many of them will give their backing to Salvini's new alliance of far-right European leaders? Osama bin Javaid, Al Jazeera, Milan.
Well, let's now introduce our guests. Theophanis Exadaktilos, Senior Lecturer in European Politics at the University of Surrey. Anand Menon, Director of the UK in a Changing Europe Initiative and a former Special Advisor to the House of Lords EU Committee. And joining us from Milan, Stefano Vergine, an Italian journalist who focuses on economics and foreign affairs. and is also co-author of the Black Book of the Lega. Gentlemen, welcome all of you to Inside Story. Theofanis Exarchopoulos, if I can start with you. We've just seen this report about that rally in Milan led by Matteo Salvini. How likely do you think it is that a lot of these far-right stroke populist parties across Europe will be able to form a functioning coalition, a functioning bloc within the European Parliament?
This is the most important question because this is the first time that we've seen these parties cooperating together. Usually they don't like each other. They don't like to be associated with each other. Right-wing nationalism has different shades. And for a lot of these parties across Europe, they have tried over time to create a more mainstream image about themselves to be able to attract more mainstream voters rather than the extremes. So they traditionally didn't like to cooperate with each other. But this time, I think they're trying to put together something that's more transnational in order to be able to tackle the issue of Europe. All of them have anti-European feelings and sentiments and public discourses, so that helps them. But at the end of the day, how much they will be able to sustain this kind of alliance going forward inside the European Parliament will remain to be seen.
Anan Menon, what do you think? Do you think there's more that unites them than divides them?
There are obviously things that unite them. They have common attitudes towards, in particular, the centrist political elite. I mean, across Europe now, you're getting this rhetoric about mainstream politics being broken. But of course, the fundamental paradox for these parties is that nationalist parties struggle to work transnationally. It's almost inherent in their DNA that, you know, they will fight. And if you take an issue like, for instance, immigration, on the one hand, yes, they want lower immigration. On the other hand, they fight amongst themselves because the right in Italy, one of their bugbears is other countries in the European Union aren't taking enough of these people that come to Europe. And, of course, that's something that they squabble amongst themselves about.
It's Stefano Vergine joining us from Milan, where, of course, that meeting took place, led by Matteo Salvini, who is not only the head of the Lega, but obviously the Deputy Prime Minister in Italy. And it does look like his party will have the majority. I mean, how was he selling it, this union of far-right parties?
Salvini is saying that these elections are very important for Lega and for the European Union, and he's trying to gather together all the European far-right parties in order to change the European Union. That's what he usually says. I agree with Mr. Menon when it comes to propose how to change it. The parties, these far-right parties, are very diverse among each other. For example, Lega and Salvini himself is trying to push public spending in Italy, so the public debt will increase. And last year they drafted a bill law which was expansionary. And Lega was criticized by AfD, which is its German ally now at the European elections.
And of course, back to the studio, Theofanis Exarchopoulos, to you. I mean, the timing wasn't great for Matteo Salvini in that meeting. That's because true. On that very day, we saw the eventual resignation of the Vice Chancellor in Austria, who was a member of a far-right party, part of a coalition, because of this video sting that that was shown, effectively showing him offering government contracts to a supposed Russian oligarch's niece. How obviously, I mean, damaging potentially maybe in Austria. But beyond that, do you think people across Europe will look at that and think, actually, we can't trust these far-right parties when they get into government? Well,
there have been equivalent reports for other parties around Europe. Classic example is the Golden Dawn. Its members have been accused of murder, participating in gangs, prosecuting immigrants and so on the streets. They have gone to jail, and still the support remains. So we have to consider how much of an effect a leader has in driving support for the party, and how much the ideology of the party has infiltrated certain segments of the voters in order to convince them to stay on despite all these allegations. So we need to see how damaging it will be for the FPÖ in Austria. But I don't think it will be that damaging for all the parties across Europe.
Anand Menon, do you agree with that? Do you think that stuff like that actually has an impact on voters in other countries?
It has an impact, but on the particular issue of links with Russia and with Vladimir Putin, it depends on the country. Because, of course, in Italy, this is very mainstream. Berlusconi was a great friend of Putin. It didn't harm him. In France, you saw the scandal over the Front National with bank loans from Russians. And again, that didn't seem to resonate. So, on the one hand, the opponents of these parties say they're dangerous, they're teaming up with our enemy, but it doesn't seem to get that much resonance amongst public opinion, and certainly not amongst supporters of these parties. It doesn't seem to make much cut through.
Stefano, that leads me to you, because, of course, one of the issues in your book, the Black Book of the Lega, was very much about potential financial links between Russia and the Lega. First of all, explain to us what you said in your book, and also what reaction there was to it in Italy when it was published, which was only a few months ago.
Yeah, well, we revealed in the book that there was a negotiation ongoing at least from July 2018 until October 2018 to fund Lega with Russian money. When I say Russian money, the negotiation that we have evidence of was between an state-owned oil-owned company by Russian state, Rosneft, and the Italian state oil company, which is Eni. So we witnessed a meeting at the Metropole Hotel in Moscow on October 18, 2018, where there was a Salvini's representative whose name is Gianluca Savoini, and some intermediaries from the Russian from Russia, people that are deemed to be strictly linked with Putin's inner circle. So basically, they were talking about Rosneft selling 3 million tons of diesel to Eni via an intermediary bank from the European Union. On this amount of diesel, they were discussing about having a 4% discount, but in the end, it was not Eni benefiting from the discount, but Lega. This is what the people were saying, and one of Salvini's representatives for Russia was there. We didn't get any reply from them, and there wasn't much coverage of the issue in Italy.
And since the publication of the book, I mean, we really have seen the Lega surge in the opinion polls that we think, they could almost double what they had in the previous elections at these EU elections. In Italy specifically, what do you think is behind the Lega's success? And then I'll ask all of our guests, why they think populism is surging. But starting with you, Stefano.
Well, it's mainly the migrant issue that is something very, very big for Italians at the moment, because of the flow of migrants that arrived in Italy over the last years, and this is what Salvini is always stressing. So he's always focusing his speeches on the migrant issue by saying, "I'm the one who is going to solve it." In fact, the number of arrivals have decreased dramatically, I would say, over the last 2 years. However, the percentage of people that are going missing or are dying on the journey to Italy in the Mediterranean Sea, these percentages is an increase.
Anand Menon, looking at populism across Europe, is immigration really the main issue, do you think?
Immigration is one of the main issues, yes. I mean, we've got to bear in mind that it's a different immigration issue in different states. So if you take Britain, what distinguishes us was a very, very sort of focused debate on EU citizens coming to the United Kingdom prior to our referendum. And that's totally different to any other member state where the debate was about people coming from outside Europe into Europe. But of course, the other common theme, I think, is a sort of anti-politics, this notion that we hear from the Brexit party in this country that mainstream politics is broken. And that's one of the reasons why we have populism rising, not just on the right, but also on the left, with radical green and radical left-wing movements as well set to do well in these elections. There's a growing sense, I think, partly because of immigration, partly because of the continuing after effects of the financial crisis and wage stagnation across Europe, that politics is somehow broken and we need to have something new to fix it.
Theofanis Exadaktilos, obviously in the Eurozone, there was also a terrible crisis, which for many countries is still ongoing. Does that go hand in hand with the immigration issue?
Of course, austerity and immigration are the two key drivers, especially in the south of Europe. The fact that it was too much of German manipulation of the bailouts, too much involvement in domestic politics. There is a sense that the previous political elites who have agreed those bailout agreements, who have agreed to austerity measures, have failed what the people really need. And this is one of the classic discourses that populist parties use, a kind of divide between the previous corrupt elites and the pure people. And this is the kind of issue that we see being reproduced over and over in political rallies from these parties. And I would agree with Anand there that it's coming both from the left and from the right. But who latches on to which particular discourse depends on where they're situated, so in which country. So, for example, in Greece, the left-wing message has been much more popular than the right-wing message. In Italy, this has not been the case. So the mainstream parties have failed to capitalize on the concerns of the people and present the alternative discourses that can potentially protect liberal democracies from the surge of the far right.
And Anand Menon, focusing on Brexit, of course, it does seem a bit absurd that nearly 3 years after this country voted to leave the EU, here we are holding European elections. I mean, when we hear a lot of the topics, immigration, as you mentioned earlier, the economy, the UK not part of the Eurozone, but certainly enormous inequality that we see is only growing here. How would you differentiate, or perhaps you think they're similar, the populist movements that we have seen in Europe with the Brexit phenomenon that we've seen here, which of course almost predates all of the big surges in Europe?
Well, firstly, what I'd say is this is the only country where those anti-European forces have significant support for leaving the European Union. What you see across populist movements in the rest of the EU is this remain and reform type approach of Salvini, reform from within. It's only in this country...
He used to want to leave.
No, absolutely, and that's changed, and it changed very noticeably in France as well, where Marine Le Pen changed her message during the presidential campaign because that issue of leaving didn't give her the resonance she wanted. And I think one of the reasons is because Brexit has proven so difficult. If you're a citizen of France or of Italy, you're watching what's happening in Britain and you're thinking, if we try to leave, not only will we have that, but we need to get a new currency as well. The difficulties of leaving have become very, very clear, I think. So in that sense, we're slightly different to the other member states because the desire to leave was a lot stronger, I think, amongst the British people than it is amongst people in other member states.
So, Stefano Vergine, what impact do you think the Brexit debate and the fact that the UK, as we've been hearing, still hasn't really managed to leave, what impact has that had on the electorate in Italy? Do they really talk about it? Does Lega, for example, use it as, you know, as an example of a country to lead, to follow?
Well, the short answer is no, in the sense that Brexit from the media and from the politicians is deemed to be a separate issue from the European Union issue. So the debate here is more about the migrant issue, as I was mentioning before, and on the budget and the fact that Italy should spend more public money in order to boost the economy, whereas the European Union, as they say, the elites in Brussels are more strict and don't want us to spend money and our economy to grow. This is mainly what the League and the Five Star Movement are saying.
Stefano, before we spoke about, you know, potential Russian links with the Lega, Steve Bannon as well, Trump's former chief strategist, has made no secret that he wants to support a Salvini-led union. Does that have an impact in a country like Italy?
Well, it has an impact, not so much because of Bannon, which is not very known among the people, ordinary people in Italy, but it did have an impact on Salvini, I think, because as we revealed in the book, the first meeting between Salvini and Bannon took place on April 2016 in Washington, D.C., when Bannon explicitly suggested Salvini to attack Pope Francis. And in fact, this is what happened right after, with Salvini tweeting against the Pope for the migrant issue, and wearing, for example, a T-shirt during a Lega's rally of Benedict, so the Pope Francis' predecessor. This led to an alliance, according to what we what we could reveal between Bannon and part of the U.S., and also with parts of the cardinals that are within the Vatican and oppose Pope Francis and his politics.
Anna and Theophanis here in the studio. I mean, Steve Bannon has always said, you know, he wants the end of mainstream politics to change the system. Just regarding him, or really the demise, perhaps, or certainly the change of mainstream politics. Theophanis, first to you. Is that what we're seeing across Europe, do you think?
Well, I think we're seeing a new version of politics, not the end of politics as we know it. But it is a new version, and we have to understand how that operates. And populist parties are very good at reinventing themselves, at capturing the spirit of the times, so to speak, whereas more mainstream parties are more rigid in their structures and the way that they approach people. So I think there needs to be a different tactic that mainstream parties can follow in order to be able to counter the surge. But it's interesting that you mentioned Steve Bannon, because what effectively that kind of support manages to do is to organize the right-wing populist parties better and provide external support, additional visibility, and so on. So there is a different way of doing things in politics, which seems to be a little bit more under the table rather than more transparent. And it's interesting because right-wing parties have the capacity to mobilize supporters. Mainstream parties don't have that capacity. And it's precisely those active messages that Steve Bannon used to bring Trump forward that have an additional effect in the European context.
And then we mentioned that the rigidity of some parties and how it could be working against them. I mean, the Conservative Party might be a case in point. We're seeing the various fringes. It's just very difficult to contain it in one party. Is that, when we think of changes to mainstream politics, perhaps the end of the big umbrella party and more smaller coalition governments?
Well, maybe. I mean, I think we need to just be a bit cautious here, because ultimately in countries like this, or in France or in Germany, you have a populist challenge, but they're not about to take over the government. I mean, the mainstream parties, you know, the European People's Party is not going to get as many votes as last time, but still looks like being the largest party in the European Parliament. So it's worth putting it in context. But yes, there is an organisational challenge here in this country, partly because the two big parties are so internally divided about Brexit that they can barely bring themselves to come up with a position, which is very, very true of the Labour Party. But also, if we look at the new Brexit party that Nigel Farage has launched, he's chief executive and leader. They have the ability to do and say whatever they want on his whim, and that gives them an agility that the longer established parties are finding it very, very hard to deal with.
And just a final question to all of you, and then perhaps starting with you. Where do you think the EU has failed in the past few years? Because obviously we are seeing the surge. It's obvious that the institution isn't responding or isn't connecting with the citizens. Where do you think it's failed?
Well, I think one of the things the EU has always failed to do, I don't think this is new, is to attract the loyalty and sort of animate its public to come out and vote in large numbers at these elections. Turnout is always low in European Parliament elections, and one of the problems the EU has is when it comes to that connection between itself and its citizens, and that's still rather weak, I would say.
Theophanis?
Well, I think there are two issues there. One is the issue of identity. So the EU has failed to create a more European identity across all 28 member states, and this is the result here that we've seen with Brexit, the distance that people feel from Europe. And the other thing is transnational solidarity, the fact that it hasn't been able to find the mechanisms to respond to problems that are happening in different parts of the EU with the appropriate means.
And Stefano Vergine, very briefly, where do you think the EU has failed?
I think mainly on coping with the economic crisis that started in 2008. I'm saying this at least on the Italian side. The feeling among ordinary people is that the European Union was not able to help Italy and other countries, such as Greece, during the economic crisis. And this is also a reason why, also within Lega, there are people saying we should leave the Eurozone and go back to our old currency in order to be able to boost the economy.
Stefano Vergine, we're going to have to leave it there. Stefano Vergine, Anna Menon, Theophanis Exadaktilos. Gentlemen, thank you so much for having shared your views with us. So thanks to all our guests, and of course, thank you for having joined us. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. But for now, from me, Barbara Serra, and the whole team here, bye for now.